Welcome back, deep divers. We're tackling something today that, well, let's be honest, we all struggle with. It's ego.
Oh, yeah. Ego. That sneaky little voice in our heads that can totally mess things up. We'll be using Ryan Holiday's book, Ego is the Enemy, as our main guide.
Ego is the enemy. The title pretty much says it all, doesn't it? And we'll sprinkle in some Robert Greene's wisdom along the way, too,
So
right?
definitely. Robert Greene is all about power dynamics, so his perspective adds another layer to this.
This deep dive is going to be like our personal mission to figure out how to tame that inner critic, that overinflated sense of self that can really hold us back. You ready for this?
Absolutely. So Holiday breaks down how ego can sabotage us in three major phases of life: aspiration, success, and failure.
Interesting, because we usually think of ego as something that pops up when you're already successful, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, look at that guy. He's got a big ego.
Right. But Holiday makes this really compelling case that it can be just as destructive, even more so in those early stages when you're just starting to dream big.
And what I appreciate is that he doesn't pretend to be above it all. He's really honest about his own struggles with ego in each of these phases.
Oh, yeah, totally. He lays out some pretty embarrassing moments, times when his ego got the better of him, and that vulnerability makes the whole thing so much more relatable.
Plus, he weaves in these historical figures like from Genghis Khan to Bill Belichick. And of course, he pulls from Stoic philosophy, which we always love.
Right, that stoic perspective is so grounding. So what are the big takeaways? Well, first, we got to really nail down what we mean by ego. We're talking about that unhealthy sense of self-importance, the arrogance, and the self-obsession.
Okay, so it's more than just having confidence. It's that thing that makes you believe you're always right, that your way is the only way.
Exactly. And he points out how our current culture, with social media and this constant pressure to project a perfect image, can actually feed that ego monster.
Yeah, it's like everyone's trying to be an influencer these days, always putting their best foot forward online.
Right. But that can distract us from doing the actual work, the stuff that truly matters. So the book is a big advocate for humility and a kind of confidence that's rooted in real achievements, not just hype.
It's about doing rather than just being or seeking attention, right?
Yeah, and it's about becoming a student, not just in the formal sense, but having that mindset of always being willing to learn no matter where you are in life.
I love that. It's so easy to get stuck in your ways, to think you've got it all figured out.
Totally. And Holiday also warns against just being blindly passionate. He actually says, don't be passionate.
Wait, really? Passion seems like such a good thing. What's wrong with that?
He's not saying don't care, but he thinks untamed passion can be self-destructive. Instead, he emphasizes purpose, having that clear why behind what you do.
So it's about channeling that passion towards something meaningful, right?
Right. And realism, too. You need a dose of reality to keep your ego in check. Understand that things take time and there are going to be setbacks along the way.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got humility, a student mindset, purpose over blind passion. And what about this canvas strategy? That sounds interesting.
Right. That's a big one. The idea is, especially when you're starting out, focus on supporting and elevating others.
Yeah.
Be the canvas for their success.
Interesting. So it's like instead of trying to grab the spotlight right away, you're contributing in a way that helps others shine.
Exactly. And in doing so, you learn, you build relationships, and ultimately, you create a much more solid foundation for your own success.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, we'll dig into what happens when ego rears its head during success and even trickier during failure.
Yeah, those are big ones. How do we stay grounded when things are going well, and how do we bounce back when we inevitably hit roadblocks?
All right, so let's dive into chapter 1. This is all about aspiration, that initial stage when we're full of dreams and big plans. How does ego mess things up here?
Well, one thing Holiday points out is the temptation to create this, perfectly curated narrative of our beginnings. We highlight all the good stuff and conveniently omit the stumbles and the doubts.
It's like we're rewriting our own history before we've even accomplished anything.
Totally. And he's brutally honest about his own experiences with this. He talks about, getting publicly ripped apart by someone he admired, almost quitting a job because he lacked confidence.
And then there's the story about that book signing where only one person showed up and he had to pretend it was intentional. Ouch.
Right. Those are things most people would keep buried deep, but he puts it all out there. And he also talks about the near collapse of his company, not once, but twice. So it's a good reminder that everyone, even those who seem super successful, has their share of struggles and setbacks.
It's so easy to look at someone's highlight reel and think, oh, they had it all figured out for the beginning.
Yeah, but that's never the full story. And this desire to project that perfect image can actually be a huge obstacle. Holiday talks about how, back in 2010, he was spending way too much time online.
Probably felt like he was building his platform, networking, all that.
Exactly. But looking back, he realized a lot of it was just busy work. He was putting off the real hard work that actually moves the needle.
I think we've all been there. It's so tempting to get caught up in that social media whirlwind, feeling productive without actually producing anything.
Totally. It's like that Kierkegaard quote he uses, mere gossip anticipates real talk. We get a little hit of dopamine just from talking about our ideas, and that can actually drain the energy we need to execute them.
So what's the antidote to all of this? How do we keep that early ego in check?
Well, Holiday asks this really fundamental question. To be or to do? Are we more concerned with the image of success, being seen as talented and successful?
Or are we actually committed to doing the work, to putting in the hours and the effort, even when no one's watching?
Exactly. And he's a big proponent of doing, of choosing the path of action over the path of just trying to look good.
He uses that military strategist, John Boyd, as a great example of this. Genghis John, they call him.
Right. Incredibly influential guy, shaped a lot of modern military thinking, but he never chased promotions, lived a very simple life. He was all about getting the work done, making a real impact, not about the glory.
Okay, so how do we become more like Genghis John? How do we cultivate that focus on doing rather than just being?
Holiday says the answer is to become a student. And he doesn't just mean going back to school, but adopting that mindset of humility and continuous learning.
So it's about being open to feedback, to guidance, to admitting that you don't know everything.
Exactly. And this is where mentors come in. It's about putting your ego aside and being willing to learn from those who are further down the path.
He uses Metallica as an example, right?
Yeah. In their early days, they were laser focused on getting better as musicians, on honing their craft. They even kicked out a band member who they felt wasn't pulling his weight musically.
That takes guts to prioritize the work over personal relationships.
Right. It shows they were serious about being students of their music. And that dedication to learning opens you up to that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
You have to be receptive to that guidance, to have the humility to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And here's where things get a little controversial. Holiday also says, don't be passionate.
Okay, now I'm really confused. Isn't passion a good thing?
He's not saying you shouldn't care, but he argues that unchecked, raw passion can actually be a liability.
How so?
Well, think about it. When you're super passionate about something, you can get easily attached to your ideas, defensive when people criticize them. You might be unwilling to adapt or change course.
It's like that blind passion can cloud your judgment.
Right. And it can lead to burnout, too. You pour all your energy into something, and then when things don't go as planned, you crash and burn.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
He proposes purpose and realism. Purpose is like passion, but it's more grounded, more directed. It's about having a clear why behind what you do, something bigger than yourself.
And realism is about understanding the actual steps involved, the day-to-day grind.
Exactly. He contrasts the statement, I am so passionate about X, with I must do Y. The first one is all about feeling. The second one implies action and commitment.
That's a good distinction. It reminds me of the Roman poet Martial, who Holiday uses as an example.
Oh yeah, Martial, so talented but so bitter. He spent years serving these wealthy patrons, and he was clearly miserable.
He wanted freedom, recognition, all that.
Exactly, and his passion for that, for the outcome, overshadowed any joy he might have found in the writing itself.
So his passion was actually working against him.
Exactly, and that leads us to the canvas strategy, which is all about, channeling your energy in a different direction.
Okay, remind me how this works again.
So the idea is, especially when you're starting out, you're probably not as good as you think you are.
Ouch, that's a hard truth.
Right. But instead of trying to grab the spotlight, the Canvas strategy says focus on supporting and elevating others who are more established.
Be the support system, the behind-the-scenes player.
Exactly. Bill Belichick is a great example. Early in his career, he took this unglamorous job analyzing film for the Baltimore Colts.
Not exactly the most exciting gig.
Right. But he excelled at it, provided valuable insights, and learned a ton in the process.
So it's about finding ways to contribute to make yourself useful, even if it's not the most glamorous role.
Exactly. And Holiday stresses that this isn't about entitlement. Just because you have a degree or some past achievements, it doesn't mean you're automatically owed anything.
You still have to prove yourself to pay your dues.
Exactly. And this is where the story of General George McClellan comes in. He was a Union general in the Civil War, had all the right credentials, but he was so obsessed with his own image, with having the perfect plan, that he became paralyzed by inaction.
So his ego actually prevented him from being effective.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how focusing too much on yourself can lead to missed opportunities and even failure.
It's like that voice in your head that station KFKD Animal Knot talks about just gets amplified by ego.
Totally. And even those seemingly harmless fantasies we have, those daydreams about our future success, those can be a subtle form of ego at work.
Because it's all about us, about how great we're going to be.
Right. And it keeps us from engaging with the present moment, with the actual work that needs to be done.
It's interesting that even Benjamin Franklin, one of the most accomplished figures in American history, recognized the dangers of pride early on.
Yeah, after getting called out for it, he consciously cultivated humility, a practice he credited with much of his later success. So it's not just about talent, it's about mindset.
So the big takeaway from this first section is that true ambition is not about chasing fame or recognition.
It's about having that quiet confidence, that unwavering focus on the work itself, on doing, rather than just being seen.
All right, let's move on to Chapter 2. This is all about success, and it seems counterintuitive that ego would be a problem here.
You'd think it would be the opposite, right? That once you've achieved success, your ego could finally relax. But Holliday argues that success can actually be ego's playground.
Because it feeds that sense of self-importance, that I'm better than everyone else attitude.
Exactly. And the story of Howard Hughes is a chilling example of how this can play out.
Oh yeah, Hughes, from brilliant innovator to recluse and hoarder.
Exactly. He had it all. Talent, money, opportunities. But his ego ultimately destroyed him. He became paranoid, erratic, made terrible decisions.
And he ended up totally isolated and miserable. A cautionary tale for sure.
Right. And it's a reminder that even with all the talent in the world, you still need virtue. You still need that ongoing commitment to learning and self-reflection.
You can't just rest on your laurels and assume you've made it.
Exactly. As the book says, ego wrecked him. And then it asks this powerful question. Can you handle success? Or will it be the worst thing that ever happened to you?
It's a question we should all ask ourselves, honestly, because success can change you in ways you might not anticipate.
And the key to navigating success effectively, according to Holliday, is to always stay a student.
So even when you're at the top of your game, you still need that beginner's mindset, that willingness to learn and adapt.
Exactly. He uses Genghis Khan as an example here, which is interesting because we usually think of him as just a brutal conqueror.
Right, not exactly known for his humility.
But he was also a brilliant strategist and, more importantly, a constant learner. He was always observing, adapting, taking the best ideas from the cultures he encountered.
So he was constantly evolving, constantly pushing himself to get better.
Exactly. And that's so important because with each new level of success, you face new challenges, new complexities.
And the skills that got you to one level might not be enough for the next.
Right. It's like John Wheeler said, as our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know.
It takes a lot of humility to acknowledge that.
Totally. And it's so easy to get comfortable in that expert role, to avoid situations where you might feel dumb.
But those are often the situations where the most growth happens.
Exactly. As Frank Shamrock put it, always stay a student, as in, it never ends. And the Mongols are a great example of this in action.
Because they were willing to change their tactics, even their beliefs, based on what they observed on the battlefield.
Exactly. They didn't let tradition or ego get in the way of adapting to new situations, which is something a lot of businesses and organizations struggle with today.
Yeah, you get stuck in your ways and suddenly you're irrelevant.
Right. And then there's the story of Bill Walsh and the 49ers. He didn't come in with this grand vision, but he established a standard of performance that focused on meticulous details, on doing the basics incredibly well.
And that attention to detail, that commitment to excellence, is what ultimately led to their success.
Exactly. And even after their first Super Bowl victory, Walsh remained humble, acknowledging that luck played a role.
He didn't let it go to his head, didn't start believing he was some kind of genius.
Right. Which is so important because Holliday warns against crafting these self-serving narratives about our successes.
We start to believe our own hype, and that can blind us to reality.
Exactly. And the 49ers themselves experienced this. They had a dip in performance after that initial Super Bowl win became overconfident.
So they had to get back to basics, to that humble approach that got them there in the first place.
Right. And the higher you climb, the more important this becomes. Because the stakes are higher, the potential for a bigger fall is greater.
We see this with companies all the time. They become successful, then they get arrogant, complacent, and suddenly they're losing market share.
Exactly. Or artists who attribute their success solely to inspiration and forget about the years of hard work that went into developing their craft.
It all comes back to knowing your why, your core purpose. That's what keeps you grounded, keeps you from chasing fleeting validation.
Right. And the story of Xerxes, the Persian king who threatened to punish the sea and a mountain for defying him, is a great, albeit dramatic, illustration of how ego can distort reality.
It's like you lose all perspective, all sense of proportion.
Totally. And then you have the opposite example, General Winfield Scott, who dismissed Jefferson Davis as an enraged imbecile.
Which is kind of ironic considering how things turned out.
Right. It shows how ego can lead to this dangerous underestimation of your opponents, this inability to see things clearly.
And ego also manifests in that need for control, for micromanaging everything.
Yeah, the John DeLorean story is a classic example of this. He had some brilliant ideas, but he was so focused on his image, on being in control, that he couldn't execute effectively.
His ego ultimately sabotaged the whole company.
Exactly. And as you move up in any organization, as you go from doing the work to leading others, a new type of humility becomes essential.
The humility to delegate, to trust your team.
Exactly. And a leader with a big ego will struggle with this. They want to be the hero, the one calling all the shots.
And that can be incredibly demotivating for the people around them.
Right. So the takeaway from this section is that success, as wonderful as it is, can be a breeding ground for ego.
And the key to navigating it effectively is to stay humble, to keep learning, and to resist the urge to believe your own hype.
And finally, we come to chapter 3, failure. How does ego impact our ability to deal with setbacks and bounce back?
This is a big one, because failure is inevitable. No matter how talented or successful you are, you're going to face obstacles, you're going to make mistakes.
It's part of the journey, right? And the question is, how does our ego shape our response?
Holiday uses that analogy of a grand ball coming to an end with the arrival of black horsemen.
Like everything's going great, and then suddenly, boom, reality hits.
And if our ego has been running the show, we're totally unprepared for those moments.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with the story of Katharine Graham, who led the Washington Post through the Watergate scandal.
Talk about a high-pressure situation.
Right. But she handled it with incredible strength and grace, focused on the mission, not on her own ego.
So she was able to rise to the occasion because she wasn't worried about protecting her image or proving she was right.
Exactly. And Holiday asks this crucial question. Will your ego betray you when things get difficult? Or can you proceed without it?
It's so easy when things go wrong to get defensive, to blame others, to make excuses.
That's the ego talking, trying to protect itself.
And that prevents us from actually learning from our mistakes.
Exactly. He talks about Bill Walsh's early years with the 49ers when he had those back-to-back 2-14 seasons.
That's a tough start.
Right. But instead of making excuses, he focused on internal improvements, on getting the team to buy into his system, and eventually it paid off.
So he turned that potential dead time into a period of growth.
Exactly. Which brings us to the concept of a lifetime or dead time. He uses the example of Malcolm X in prison.
Who transformed that experience into a period of intense learning and self-discovery.
Right. He chose to make it a lifetime. And we all have that choice, even in difficult situations.
It's about how we frame it, how we choose to respond.
Exactly. And the ego wants us to wallow in self-pity, to blame others, but that's a dead end.
So how do we shift our mindset, even when it feels like the world is crashing down around us?
Well, Holiday talks about Belisarius, this brilliant Byzantine general who faced all sorts of betrayals and setbacks despite his loyalty and accomplishments.
And yet he continued to serve, continued to do what he believed was right.
Right, because his sense of purpose was bigger than his need for external validation. And that's a powerful lesson for all of us.
Because there will be times when our hard work isn't recognized, when we face injustice.
And if we're solely reliant on that external validation, on praise and rewards, we're going to be in trouble.
So we need to find that internal motivation, that sense of purpose that drives us even when the going gets tough.
Exactly. And the story of Alexander the Great and Diogenes is a great illustration of this.
Remind me that story again.
So Alexander, at the height of his power, offered Diogenes, this philosopher who lived a very simple life, any favor he wanted.
And what did Diogenes ask for?
He asked Alexander to step aside so he wouldn't block the sun.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
Right. It shows that true contentment, true purpose, comes from within, not from external validation.
So even when the world is throwing us curveballs, we need to stay connected to that inner compass.
Exactly. And failure, as painful as it can actually be an opportunity for immense growth.
It strips away the illusions, forces us to confront our weaknesses.
Right. It can be a really humbling experience, which is exactly what the ego needs.
But of course, the ego doesn't want to admit that it was wrong, so it tries to protect itself.
And that's when we make bad decisions, double down on failed strategies, lash out at others.
So it's crucial to recognize those ego-driven reactions and choose a different path.
Exactly. Remember that failure is a temporary state, not a reflection of your worth.
The story of Tom Brady is a great example of this. He was a low draft pick, overlooked by most teams, but he never let that define him.
He kept working, kept improving, and became one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time.
It works that even from a perceived failure, amazing things are possible if you have the right mindset.
Exactly. So the takeaway from this section is that failure is inevitable, but it's how we respond that determines our ultimate success.
And the key is to keep our ego in check, to learn from our mistakes, and to never give up on ourselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that this battle with our ego is an ongoing one.
It's like that old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom.
Exactly. Managing your ego is a daily practice. You can't just conquer it once and be done with it.
It's so easy to get seduced by that quick hit of ego gratification, that feeling of superiority or self-righteousness.
Right. And as Holiday points out, it's like a drug. It feels good in the moment, but it ultimately leads to destructive behavior.
And the damage isn't always obvious or catastrophic. It can be subtle, like a slow erosion of our relationships or our sense of purpose.
Exactly. And Bismarck had this great quote, "Any fool can learn from experience. The trick is to learn from other people's experience."
Which is what Ryan Holiday's done in this book. He shared his own struggles and the lessons he's learned from observing others.
So we encourage you, our listener, to really reflect on these ideas. Think about specific instances in your own life, in your aspirations, your successes, your failures.
Where might ego have been at play? How might things have unfolded differently if you had approached those situations with more humility, more awareness of your own ego?
That's a powerful question to consider.
All right, deep divers, that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Ego is the Enemy. We hope it's given you some valuable insights to take with you on your own journey.
And remember, staying aware of our ego, of those subtle ways it tries to sabotage us, is an ongoing process.
It's a battle worth fighting, though, because taming that ego is essential to achieving true fulfillment and lasting success.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
See you on the next dive.